Captain Jake Morrison sat in the lowest tier of the Great Council chambers on Nexus Prime and watched as 847 alien species decided the fate of the galaxy. The massive dome stretched high above him with seats arranged in perfect circles that rose toward the crystal ceiling like stairs to heaven. At the very top sat the most powerful species, while humans occupied the bottom row like children. At the adult table, the air hummed with translation, devices that turned thousands of different languages into something his brain could understand. Beside him, Dr. Lisa Kane adjusted her tablet and prepared to take notes on another day of being ignored by beings who thought humans were barely worth their time. Ambassador. Vexthal stood at the speaking platform in the center of the chamber. The reptilian creature was over 7 feet tall, with scales that changed color when he spoke. Today they showed deep red patterns that Jake had learned meant contempt. The Saurian diplomat held a small device that projected images above his head for all to see. Honored council members, Vexthal began with his voice carrying easily through the vast space. We gather today to discuss the application of species designation 7432 for full membership status. He paused and his scales shifted to show amusement. The species that calls itself humanity. A low murmur ran through the chamber like wind through leaves. Jake felt his jaw tighten but kept his face neutral. 53 years ago, humans had been accepted as junior members with limited voting rights and the promise that full membership would come with time and proof of worthiness. That time never seemed to come. I bring before you evidence, Vexthal continued, of why this species lacks the sophistication required for full council. Participation. The device in his clawed hand activated, and suddenly the air above the chamber filled with holographic displays of human history. The first image showed a group of armored knights sitting around a round table. Their leader wore a crown and held a sword that seemed to glow with inner light. They worship primitive warrior kings, Vexthal said with scales now showing bright orange mockery. They tell stories of magic swords and quests for mystical cups as if these fairy tales were real history. Laughter echoed through the chamber from dozens of different species. Jake recognized the chittering of the insect-like vespans and the deep booming sounds that passed for humor among the gas giant dwellers. Dr. Kane leaned toward him and whispered, "He is showing them King Arthur and the Round Table." The image changed to show warriors in horned helmets charging across a battlefield with axes raised. They believe their dead fighters go to a hall of eternal combat, Vexthal continued. They think violence in life earns rewards in death. More laughter filled the air as the hologram shifted to show the great hall of Valhalla with its endless feast and daily battles. Look, here, the ambassador said as new images appeared. Now the display showed 300 Spartan warriors standing in a narrow mountain pass, facing thousands of enemy soldiers. They glorify hopeless last stands where a few fight against impossible odds. They make heroes of those too stupid to retreat when defeat is certain. The sound of alien laughter grew louder. Jake could see representatives from the peaceful crystalline collective, shimmering with what he knew was their version of humor. Even the usually silent deep dwellers were making the low humming sounds that meant they found something amusing. Dr. Kane gripped her tablet tighter as the images continued. Samurai warriors appeared next, kneeling in ritual suicide rather than face dishonor. Native American warriors danced around fires and spoke to spirits that existed only in their imagination. Celtic heroes charged into battle painted blue and screaming war cries like wild animals. This is what they call culture, Vexthal declared with his scales now showing the deep purple of disgust. Stories of ghosts and magic, of warriors who fight hopeless battles, of codes of honor that value death over practical survival. These are not the myths of an advanced species ready for full membership. These are the savage fantasies of a race that still thinks violence and sacrifice solve problems. The chamber erupted in the loudest laughter yet. Jake could see representatives literally falling off their seats in some cases. The elephant-like pachyderm delegates were trumpeting with glee, while the floating energy beings that made up the light chorus pulsed in rhythm with their amusement. Dr. Kane stood up slowly. "Honored Council," she began, but her voice was lost in the continuing laughter. She tried again, louder. "If I may explain the cultural significance of these stories." "Cultural significance," Vexthal interrupted with scales now flashing yellow patterns of dismissal. What culture teaches its young that dying for strangers is noble? What wisdom tells people to fight when running would save their lives? What philosophy says that keeping your word matters more than keeping your life? A new voice joined the conversation. Council Prime Zarmuth, the ancient crystalline being who oversaw all proceedings, spoke with words that rang like bells through the chamber. The ambassador raises valid concerns. Species that cannot move beyond primitive mythologies of violence and sacrifice pose risks to Council. Stability. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach as murmurs of agreement rippled through the seated aliens. He had heard this before in different words, but always with the same meaning. Humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too willing to fight when they should negotiate. I propose, Zarmuth continued, that we postpone humanity's application for full membership indefinitely pending evidence of cultural evolution beyond these barbaric fantasy stories. The vote was swift and overwhelming. Only 7 species voted against the motion, and Jake suspected they did it more from politeness than actual support. Dr. Kane sank back into her seat with defeat written across her face. As the session moved on to other business, Jake sat in silence and watched alien beings discuss trade routes and scientific exchanges. Around him, the great chamber buzzed with the sounds of advanced civilization, making important decisions about the future of the galaxy. But all he could hear were the echoes of laughter at stories his grandfather had told him about brave men and women who stood up when everything seemed lost. He thought about the knights who rode out knowing they might not return but rode anyway because someone had to. He remembered the warriors who held the line when retreat would have been smarter, but holding meant others could escape. He considered the samurai who chose death over dishonor, and the Native Americans who spoke to spirits the modern world said did not exist. These beings around him had never needed such stories. They had built their civilizations through logic and cooperation and scientific progress. They had never faced the kind of darkness that required someone to stand alone against impossible odds with nothing but determination and the hope that their sacrifice might matter. Jake Morrison looked up at the crystal ceiling far above and wondered if these advanced species would still be laughing when they finally met something that could not be reasoned with, negotiated with, or defeated through superior technology. He wondered what they would do when they needed heroes instead of diplomats. But for now they laughed and called human legends primitive fairy tales. The mockery echoed through the chamber like thunder, and Jake stored the sound in his memory where it would wait like a seed in winter soil. The Devourer fleet consumed 3 more star systems, while the Galactic Council debated whether to give humanity permission to coordinate their defense. Each world that vanished took billions of lives with it, and left nothing but empty space where civilizations had thrived for thousands of years. The mathematical projections grew worse with each passing day, and panic spread through the core systems as evacuation ships began launching toward distant galaxies. Captain Jake Morrison spent those critical weeks in constant communication with Earth, and the human colonies scattered across 53 systems. The response to his call for volunteers was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Not just military personnel, but civilians, scientists, engineers, miners, farmers, and colonists answered the summons. They came not because they believed they could win, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Dr. Lisa Kane watched the transformation with growing amazement. In the Council archives, she studied reports of how other species had responded to existential threats throughout galactic history. Always the pattern was the same: evacuation, negotiation, technological solutions, or surrender. Never had an entire species voluntarily moved toward certain destruction, simply because someone had to make a stand. Commander Tony Mitchell arrived at Nexus, Prime aboard a transport ship carrying 2,000 volunteers from the outer colonies. His unit called themselves the Spartan Regiment, though they carried modern weapons and wore standard military armor. When Council security asked about their name, Mitchell simply said they were honoring men who understood that some things were worth dying for. Major Kate Phillips brought her special operations teams from the frontier worlds where humans had learned to survive against impossible odds. Her people moved with the quiet confidence of those who had faced death many times and made peace with the possibility. They wore patches showing ancient Celtic knotwork and carried personal weapons engraved with runes that had no meaning to alien linguists. Chief Petty Officer Danny Brooks led a group of Navy veterans who had served in the outer colony wars where human settlements had fought off pirate raids and hostile alien incursions. His people were older than the others, and moved with the careful efficiency of those who had survived when survival seemed impossible. They flew battle flags that showed ancient Viking longships sailing through starfields. The aliens in the council chambers watched these strange humans with growing confusion. Advanced civilizations prepared for war with careful logistics and detailed strategic planning. They assembled their best technology and their most experienced officers to create efficient, military machines designed to achieve victory through superior capabilities. But humans seemed to be doing something entirely different. They gathered people who volunteered to fight knowing they would probably die. They organized themselves around ancient symbols and mythic codes that had no practical military value. They spoke in terms of honor and duty and sacrifice as if these concepts mattered more than tactical advantage or technological superiority. They are conducting some form of cultural ritual, reported Dr. Zenth of the Analytical Collective, after studying human preparations for 2 weeks. They appear to be recreating behavior patterns from their primitive legends, rather than focusing on practical military solutions. Vexthul studied the reports with scales showing deep confusion. They bring farmers and miners to fight machines that consume entire planets. They organize their forces around ancient warrior codes that predate spaceflight. Either they have completely lost their sanity, or they understand something about warfare that we do not. The breakthrough came when Dr. Lisa Kane realized what she was witnessing. The mythic patterns that the council had mocked were emerging as practical responses to an impossible situation. Veterans formed honor guards that functioned exactly like the Round Table Knights, bound by codes of conduct that made retreat unthinkable. Special forces units adopted samurai principles of absolute loyalty and willingness to die for their comrades. Colony defenders organized themselves into small units like Spartan phalanxes that could operate independently but fight as one. It is not ritual, she reported to Captain Morrison during one of their daily briefings. It is transformation. The legends are becoming real because the situation requires the virtues those legends represent. When you face absolute evil that cannot be reasoned with, you need people who will stand and fight regardless of the odds. Jake understood what she meant when he visited the human staging areas around Nexus Prime. He walked through camps where 10,000 volunteers prepared for a war they could not win and saw things that should not have been possible in the age of space travel and quantum physics. He saw young colonists sitting around campfires listening to old veterans tell stories about heroes who chose death over dishonor. He watched engineers building weapons while singing ancient battle songs that their grandparents had taught them. He observed doctors and nurses preparing field hospitals while wearing medical crosses that honored traditions older than their civilization. Most remarkable of all, he saw representatives from other species beginning to join them. Not many at first, just individuals here and there who had grown tired of running and hiding, a few crystalline entities whose homeworlds had been evacuated, some young Saurians who disagreed with their government's retreat policies, scattered members of peaceful species who had decided that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed hopeless. The alien volunteers were changed by contact with human preparations. They began to understand that the humans were not simply being irrational or primitive. They were accessing something deeper than logic or technology, something that connected them to the fundamental truth that civilizations must sometimes be defended by people willing to sacrifice everything for strangers they would never meet. Admiral Blake established his command post on the flagship Guardian and began coordinating the strangest military force in galactic history. His official reports to Earth Command described a fleet of mixed human and alien vessels, crewed by volunteers who had no expectation of survival. His personal logs told a different story about watching myths come to life in the darkness between stars. The Devourer advance continues toward the core systems, he recorded during one of his private communications. Mathematical analysis indicates they will reach Nexus Prime in 4 months. Our combined fleet consists of approximately 800 vessels of various sizes and capabilities. The enemy fleet numbers in the thousands, with individual ships larger than our biggest battleships. He paused and looked out at the lights of human camps scattered across 3 different asteroid fields. By every measure of military science, we should evacuate immediately and preserve what forces we can for a fighting retreat. But something strange is happening among the volunteers. They are not behaving like soldiers preparing for a hopeless battle. They are behaving like heroes from the old stories stepping into legend. The final piece fell into place when reports came back from the forward scout missions. Human reconnaissance teams had been making dangerous runs toward Devourer positions to gather intelligence about enemy capabilities and weaknesses. The information they brought back was disturbing, but it confirmed what Dr. Kane had begun to suspect. The Devourers were not just advanced machines. They were entities that existed according to pure mathematical logic and quantum precision. They consumed matter by manipulating the fundamental forces that held atoms together. They moved through space by calculating exact trajectories and energy requirements. They functioned as a perfect expression of logical efficiency applied to the task of consumption and growth. They are the opposite of everything human mythology represents, Dr. Kane explained to the assembled command staff. They cannot understand sacrifice that serves no practical purpose. They cannot process the concept of fighting when retreat would be more efficient. They cannot calculate the mathematics of people who choose death over surrender. Jake Morrison looked around the briefing room at the faces of humans and aliens who had volunteered to stand against entities that had never been defeated. Then maybe it is time, he said quietly, to show them what happens when legends become real. The Devourer fleet changed course 3 days later and began accelerating directly toward Nexus Prime. Long-range sensors indicated they had detected the gathering of ships around the Council homeworld and identified them as a potential threat to be eliminated. The final confrontation would come not at some distant battlefield, but in the heart of galactic civilization itself. As news of the approaching enemy spread through the core systems, the Great Evacuation began. Millions of beings fled toward distant galaxies in ships packed beyond capacity. Entire governments relocated their operations to hidden bases in unexplored regions of space. The greatest libraries and art collections in galactic history were loaded onto transports and sent toward safe harbor among the outer stars. But 10,000 humans and the aliens who had joined them remained at Nexus Prime and prepared to make their stand. They gathered around ancient battle standards and sang songs that had been old when their species first looked up at the stars. They spoke oaths of loyalty that had been written before humans learned to build starships. The Devourer fleet arrived at the edge of the Nexus system like a plague of mechanical locusts that blotted out the stars. Long-range sensors counted over 3,000 vessels ranging from small scout units the size of human destroyers to massive world ships that dwarfed anything in the galactic archives. They moved in perfect formation with mathematical precision that spoke of minds that had calculated every variable and planned for every possible. Resistance General Maria Santos had taken overall command of the combined human and alien defense force from her flagship, the Liberty. She stood in the command center studying tactical displays that showed the hopeless mathematics of their situation. Her forces consisted of 812 ships crewed by volunteers from 63 different species. Most were human vessels with weapons and shields that were generations behind galactic standard technology. Enemy fleet composition. Analysis complete, reported her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Ben Wright. We are outnumbered approximately 4-1 by vessels with individual firepower ratings that exceed our entire fleet combined. They also demonstrate the ability to manipulate matter at the quantum level, which makes conventional defensive strategies ineffective. Santos nodded grimly and activated the fleet communication system. Across 800 ships, the faces of captains and crew members appeared on screens, humans and aliens who had volunteered for this impossible fight. She looked at each face and saw the same expression she had observed in historical recordings of soldiers preparing for hopeless battles throughout human history. All ships prepare for combat operations, she announced. Remember that we are not here to win. We are here to stand. We are here to show the galaxy that some things cannot be calculated or consumed or reduced to mathematical formulas. We are here to prove that legends become real when people decide to live them. Dr. Alex Turner worked frantically in his laboratory aboard the science vessel Discovery, analyzing data collected by scout teams that had made suicidal runs against the advancing enemy. What he found defied every principle of physics and warfare that galactic civilization had developed over millions of years of experience. The Devourers operate through absolute quantum precision, he reported to Santos during an emergency briefing. Every action they take follows perfect mathematical logic, designed to achieve maximum efficiency with minimum energy expenditure. But this precision is also their weakness. Turner brought up holographic displays showing Devourer combat patterns from previous engagements. They calculate optimal responses based on predictable enemy behavior. When the Zentaurans fought logically using standard tactical doctrine, the Devourers countered every move perfectly. When the Harmony worlds attempted to flee in organized evacuation patterns, the enemy anticipated every route and intercepted them with mathematical certainty. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" Santos asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Chaos," Turner replied simply. "The more unpredictably we behave, the more errors their calculations will contain. Logic is their strength, but it is also their limitation. They cannot compute responses to actions that make no rational sense." Santos smiled with the expression of a warrior who had finally found an enemy she understood how to fight. "Then we give them something that has never existed in their mathematical models. We give them humans acting like the heroes from their own legends." The first engagement took place at the Kepler defense line, a hastily constructed series of orbital platforms and minefields built around the outer planets of the Nexus system. By every measure of military science, it was an indefensible position that should have been abandoned weeks earlier. But humans had never been particularly good at following military science when honor demanded something different. Commander Jake Phillips led the first assault wave in his modified Corvette Defiance. Behind him came 300 volunteer pilots flying everything from military fighters to converted civilian craft, armed with improvised weapons. They charged directly into the Devourer formation with no tactical coordination and no logical battle plan. All ships attack at will, Phillips transmitted as energy beams from enemy vessels began tearing through human ranks. Remember the Alamo, remember Thermopylae, remember everyone who ever stood against impossible odds because it was the right thing to do. The results were immediate and shocking. Devourer vessels that had responded perfectly to logical military attacks found themselves unable to calculate responses to human fighters that behaved like berserkers from ancient mythology. Pilots who should have retreated when their shields failed instead rammed their damaged ships into enemy hulls. Squadrons that should have regrouped, when taking casualties instead, scattered in random directions that made no tactical sense but created computational chaos in Devourer targeting systems. For the first time since their emergence from the galactic void, the ancient machines experienced something they had no programming to handle. Opponents who acted against their own survival interests in ways that served no logical purpose. Their quantum calculations began producing error cascades as they tried to predict the behavior of beings who would die for strangers and fight when fighting was pointless. The first human victory was small and costly. Phillips and most of his pilots died in the engagement, but they managed to destroy 12 Devourer vessels and damage dozens more. More importantly, they proved that the enemy could be hurt by people willing to embrace the mythic virtues that galactic civilization had mocked as primitive fairy tales news. Of the impossible victory spread through the refugee fleets fleeing toward distant galaxies, species that had written off the human defense as a meaningless gesture began watching the battle reports with growing amazement. The mathematical impossibility of primitive humans damaging advanced Devourer technology challenged everything they thought they understood about warfare and survival. Major Kate Phillips took command of the second wave assault with 500 volunteers flying in formations that honored ancient Celtic and Viking battle tactics. Her people painted their ships with war symbols that had no meaning to alien observers but connected them to warriors who had fought against overwhelming odds throughout human history. "We are the children of people who charge machine gun nests with swords," she transmitted, as her forces approached the enemy fleet. "We are descended from warriors who fought dragons and gods and the darkness itself. Today we find out if their blood still runs in our veins." The second engagement was even more chaotic than the first. Phillips led her people in attack patterns that resembled berserker raids more than space combat. They ignored tactical doctrine and flew directly into enemy formations, while screaming battle cries in languages that predated spaceflight. When their weapons failed, they used their ships as weapons. When their ships were destroyed, they ejected in escape pods and continued fighting with personal arms. The Devourer response grew, increasingly erratic as their computational system struggled to process human behavior that violated every principle of logical warfare. Enemy ships began firing at targets that posed no tactical threat simply because their programming could not calculate the meaning of human actions. Some Devourer vessels started attacking each other. When their targeting systems became confused by the mathematical paradox of opponents who fought harder when they were losing. The alien volunteers who had joined the human cause watched these engagements with growing understanding. They began to see that humans were not simply being irrational or suicidal. They were accessing something deeper than logic, something that connected them to the fundamental truth that some things were worth more than survival. Crystalline beings who had fled their homeworlds returned to join the fight. Young Saurians defied their government's evacuation orders and volunteered for suicide missions. Representatives from dozens of species that had never engaged in warfare began requesting permission to serve aboard human vessels. "Something is changing," reported Admiral Blake to Earth Command during one of his increasingly brief communications. "The aliens are not just fighting alongside us anymore. They are fighting like us." I watched a pachyderm engineer ram his transport ship into a devourer world ship yesterday, while singing an old human folk song about heroes who never came home. The transformation spread beyond the immediate battle zone. In refugee camps across the galaxy, displaced beings began telling stories about the humans who had stayed behind to fight the darkness. They spoke of warriors who charged impossible odds because someone had to make a stand. They shared legends of heroes who chose death over surrender and found victory in sacrifice. Most remarkably, some of the refugees began turning around. Ships that had fled toward the outer galaxies changed course and headed back toward Nexus Prime. They came not because they believed they could change the outcome of the battle, but because they had remembered something important about what it meant to be worthy of civilization. The remnant fleet grew larger each day as survivors from consumed worlds joined the human defense. They brought ships and weapons, but more importantly, they brought the understanding that running from evil only ensured that evil would eventually catch up. 6 months after the laughter in the council chambers had died away, something appeared at the edge of known space that made every advanced civilization in the galaxy forget about human fairy tales. The first reports came from the Outer Rim territories where long-range sensors detected massive objects moving through the void between stars. At first, the scientists thought they were asteroids or failed planets drifting through the darkness, but then the objects changed course. Admiral Ryan Blake stood on the bridge of the UES Guardian and studied the data streaming across his screens. Behind him, Lieutenant Sophie Davis worked frantically at her communication station, trying to raise any response from the Zentoran home system. For 3 hours, they had been sending signals into empty space where a thriving civilization of 12 billion beings had lived just days before. "Still nothing, sir," Sophie reported with her voice tight with strain. "Long-range scans show no life signs, no energy signatures, no debris fields. It is like they just stopped existing." Blake nodded grimly and turned to the tactical display that showed the movement of the unknown objects. Each one was roughly the size of a small moon, but they moved with purpose and intelligence. Worse, they seemed to be getting bigger as they traveled, consuming everything in their path and converting matter into pure energy. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 12 hours later with representatives arriving from across known space. The great chamber that had recently echoed with laughter at human legends now buzzed with fear and confusion. Ambassador Vexthul took his place among the Saurian delegation, but his scales showed none of their usual proud colors. Instead, they displayed the gray patterns that meant deep worry. Council Prime Zarmoth called the session to order with bell-like tones that barely carried over the nervous chatter of hundreds of species. "We face an unprecedented situation," the crystalline being announced. "Initial contact protocols have failed. The entities show no response to communication attempts in any known language or mathematical format." Captain Jake Morrison sat in his usual place in the lowest tier and watched as the most advanced minds in the galaxy struggled to understand what they faced. The holographic displays showed the path of destruction left by the entities that military analysts had started calling the Devourers. System after system simply vanished as the massive objects passed through, leaving nothing but empty space and cosmic dust. Dr. Lisa Kane leaned toward Jake and whispered, "The Zentorans lasted 3 hours. The hegemony worlds managed 6 hours of resistance before they were completely consumed. These things do not conquer or negotiate. They just unmake everything." The mathematical projections appeared in the air above the chamber, showing predicted paths and timeframes. Species representatives began making worried sounds in dozens of different languages as they saw the inevitable conclusion. The Devourer fleet was heading toward the core systems of galactic civilization. At their current rate of advance, they would reach Nexus Prime within 18 months. "We must establish communication," declared Ambassador Krell of the Harmonious Collective. His people had spent millennia perfecting the art of peaceful negotiation, and had never met a problem that could not be solved through patient diplomacy. "Every species has needs and desires. We must discover what these entities want and find a way to accommodate them." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. This was how civilized beings handled problems. They talked and compromised and found solutions that benefited everyone involved. Violence was primitive and unnecessary when intelligent minds could work together. Vexthul stood at his speaking position with scales showing the deep blue of formal address. "The Saurian Republic offers our most advanced translation matrices and communication arrays. We propose sending a diplomatic mission with representatives from all major species to establish contact and begin negotiations." More agreement filled the air. Jake watched as hundreds of alien minds focused on the same approach they had used for thousands of years: send diplomats, establish communication, find common ground, make a deal. It was logical and civilized and had worked for longer than human civilization had existed. The vote was unanimous, except for one abstention. Jake had not raised his hand either for or against the proposal. He simply sat quietly and thought about fairy tales while the galaxy prepared to send its best negotiators to meet entities that consumed entire star systems for fuel. 3 weeks later, the diplomatic mission launched with great ceremony. The finest minds in galactic civilization traveled toward the advancing Devourer fleet in ships equipped with every form of communication technology ever developed. They carried gifts and mathematical proofs of peaceful intent. They brought cultural exchanges and scientific knowledge to share. They never came back. The emergency beacon activated 2 days after the mission entered Devourer space. The signal lasted exactly 47 seconds before cutting off forever. Long-range sensors detected a brief energy spike consistent with total matter conversion. 12 ships carrying the diplomatic elite of galactic civilization had been turned into fuel for entities that did not care about gifts or knowledge or peaceful intentions. The second emergency council session was very different from the first. Fear had replaced confusion, and panic threatened to overwhelm the careful protocols of civilized debate. Representatives stood and shouted in languages that translation devices could barely keep up with. Some demanded immediate evacuation of core systems, while others called for military mobilization. The Crystalline Collective suggests immediate retreat to the outer galaxy clusters, announced one shimmering delegate. "We can rebuild our civilizations beyond their reach and return when the threat has passed. The Deep Dwellers recommend hiding in subspace dimensions until these entities move beyond our territory," added another voice from the chamber depths. Jake listened to species after species propose the same basic strategy: run, hide, wait for the problem to go away. It was logical thinking from beings who had never faced a threat that could not be negotiated with or avoided through superior technology. They could not imagine an enemy that existed only to consume and grow stronger. Admiral Blake sent regular reports from the human fleet positions at the edge of Council space. While alien species debated evacuation routes, he had been quietly moving Earth's modest military forces into defensive positions. Compared to the vast fleets of older civilizations, humanity could barely put 50 ships into space, but every one of them was designed for combat. "The Council grows more desperate each day," Jake reported during his weekly communication with Earth Command. "They have tried everything they know how to do. Diplomacy failed, communication failed, retreat is their only remaining option." "And what do you think, Captain?" asked the voice of General Hayes from across the light years. Jake looked out through the chamber windows at the stars that filled the night sky above Nexus Prime. Somewhere out there, ancient machines moved through the darkness, turning entire worlds into energy. Behind him, the greatest minds in galactic civilization argued about where to run and how far to flee. "I think, sir, that we are about to discover whether fairy tales have any practical value," he replied. The third Devourer attack came without warning. The Harmony worlds were a peaceful cluster of 7 planets dedicated to art and philosophy. They had no military defenses and no weapons capable of harming anything larger than a small spacecraft. The Devourers consumed all 7 worlds in less than 2 hours. The holographic display in the council chamber showed the mathematical reality that no one wanted to accept. At their current rate of expansion, The Devourer fleet would strip every populated system in the galaxy within 5 years. Evacuation was impossible on that scale, and hiding would only delay the inevitable. Council Prime Zarmoth stood at the center of the chamber with crystalline form, dim with despair. The entities cannot be communicated with, cannot be bargained with, and cannot be deterred by any technology we possess. We face extinction as a galactic civilization. The silence that followed was the sound of 846 species contemplating the end of everything they had built over millions of years. In that silence, Jake Morrison stood up from his seat in the lowest tier and cleared his throat. "If I may," he said in the calm voice he had learned during his military service, "humanity would like to volunteer to coordinate the defense." The laughter that greeted his words was different from the mockery 6 months earlier. This time it was the desperate laughter of beings who had run out of hope and found dark humor in the impossible. But when Jake did not sit down and did not smile, the laughter slowly died away. "You cannot be serious," Vexthul said with scales showing the orange of disbelief. "Your species has 50 ships and weapons that are centuries behind our technology. What could you possibly do that we cannot?" Jake looked around the vast chamber at all the representatives of advanced civilization, who had exhausted their options, and found themselves facing an enemy that could not be reasoned with. "We can tell you a story," he said quietly, "about 300 warriors who held a mountain pass against impossible odds because someone had to make a stand." The final battle began at dawn over Nexus Prime, as the Devourer fleet moved into bombardment position above the Council homeworld. Their massive world ships cast shadows across entire continents, while smaller vessels swarmed through the upper atmosphere like mechanical locusts preparing to strip away everything that had ever lived or grown or dreamed on the planet below. Captain Emma Walsh piloted her fighter Excalibur through the chaos of the last engagement with a strike team composed of volunteers from 17 different species. Her mission was impossible by every measure of military science. Penetrate the enemy formation, reach the Devourer core ship, and somehow damage the quantum intelligence that coordinated the entire fleet. The chances of success were so small that military computers refused to calculate them. Behind her flew pilots who had given up everything to be here. Lieutenant Sam Baker had been a farmer on New Texas before answering the call to defend strangers he would never meet. Ensign Rachel Moore had left her job as a school teacher to learn how to fly combat missions against enemies that consumed worlds. Chief Warrant Officer Tim Brooks was supposed to retire next month, but had volunteered for one last mission because someone had to carry the torch. "Strike team leader to all units," Emma transmitted as they approached the nightmare geometry of the Devourer core ship. "Remember that we are not here because we think we can win. We are here because legends become real when people decide to live them." The alien volunteers who flew with them had been transformed by contact with human mythic thinking. Saurian pilot Kessatar had painted ancient Celtic knotwork on his fighter and spoke of honor codes that his people had forgotten centuries ago. Crystalline entity Chardonnal flew in formation patterns that resembled Spartan phalanx tactics, while transmitting battle songs in languages older than his civilization. Pachyderm engineer Trunkmore had rigged his transport with improvised weapons and swore oaths of loyalty that echoed samurai traditions. The Devourer core ship was a structure that defied conventional understanding of physics and engineering. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers through space with surfaces that bent light around them and generated gravity fields that pulled matter from nearby asteroids directly into processing chambers. At its heart was the quantum intelligence that had calculated the consumption of entire star systems with mathematical precision. General Santos watched the strike team's approach from her command post aboard the flagship Liberty. Around her, the tactical displays showed the final positions of a defense that had achieved impossible victories through the simple refusal to accept defeat. Hundreds of volunteer ships held their positions in orbit above Nexus Prime, facing odds that should have destroyed them weeks ago. "All remaining fleet units maintain defensive positions," she ordered, as Devourer forces began their final assault on the planet's surface. "Fight until you cannot fight anymore, then fight some more. Today we prove that fairy tales have power when people believe in them enough to die for them." Dr. Alex Turner worked frantically in his laboratory, analyzing the quantum signatures radiating from the enemy core ship. What he discovered was both terrifying and hopeful in ways that challenged everything galactic science understood about consciousness and intelligence. The Devourer's central intelligence is not just a computer, he reported during his final transmission. It is a pure expression of mathematical logic applied to the problem of infinite consumption. But logic has limitations that it cannot overcome through calculation alone. Turner's analysis revealed the fundamental weakness that human instinct had sensed from the beginning. The Devourers understood efficiency and growth and the conversion of matter into energy, but they could not comprehend the concept of willing sacrifice for others. Their quantum minds had no programming for beings who chose death over surrender, or who fought harder when defeat became certain. Emma Walsh led her strike team through the defensive perimeter of the core ship as energy weapons tore through their formation. Half her pilots died in the first 30 seconds of the engagement, but the survivors continued their approach with the calm determination of people who had made peace with their own mortality. "Target the central processing nodes," she ordered as they penetrated deeper into the maze of crystalline structures that surrounded the Devourer intelligence. "Remember that we carry the hopes of everyone who ever stood against impossible odds, because it was the right thing to do." The alien pilots fought with a fury that surprised their own species. Kessitar rammed his damaged fighter into a defensive platform while transmitting ancient Saurian war cries that had not been heard for 1,000 years. Chardinal used his crystalline form to channel energy directly into enemy systems while singing battle hymns that predated galactic civilization. Trunkmore flew his transport into the core ship's main weapon array and detonated his improvised explosives with a roar that echoed across all communication frequencies. Emma reached the central chamber of the Devourer intelligence with only 2 other pilots still alive. Before them stretched a structure that hurt to look at directly. A crystalline matrix that existed in dimensions beyond normal space-time. At its heart pulsed the quantum mind that had calculated the destruction of entire civilizations with perfect mathematical precision. "This is Strike Leader Walsh to all remaining forces," she transmitted as enemy defenses converged on their position. "We have reached the core. Whatever happens next, remember that legends become real when people choose to live them." She armed every weapon her fighter carried and began her final approach toward the heart of the quantum intelligence. Behind her, the last 2 pilots followed with the calm courage of people who had found something worth dying for. They flew not because they believed they could win, but because someone had to make the stand. The moment of contact between human heroism and quantum logic created a paradox that the Devourer intelligence could not resolve. Emma Walsh died as her fighter was torn apart by energy weapons, but her sacrifice created a mathematical impossibility in the enemy's computational matrix. The quantum mind tried to calculate the logic of beings who chose certain death to protect strangers they would never meet and found that the equation produced infinite recursive loops. The error cascaded through the Devourer network like a virus of impossible mathematics. Core systems began shutting down as quantum processors tried to solve the paradox of heroic sacrifice, and failed. Secondary intelligences became trapped in calculation loops that had no logical resolution. The entire fleet structure began experiencing systematic failures as the central coordination matrix collapsed under the weight of human virtue. One by one, the massive Devourer ships began tearing themselves apart as their quantum minds fought to process concepts that existed beyond mathematical logic. The world ships that had consumed entire star systems flickered out of existence as their matter manipulation systems failed. The swarm fleets that had moved with perfect coordination began attacking each other as their targeting systems became confused by recursive calculation errors. On the surface of Nexus Prime, the few remaining council members watched through observation windows as impossible victory unfolded in the space above their heads. The fleet that had seemed unstoppable was destroying itself, trying to understand why beings would choose death over survival and sacrifice over self-preservation. Ambassador Vex Thule stood beside Captain Jake Morrison in the council chambers and watched the last of the Devourer ships fade from the tactical displays. His scales showed colors that his species had no words for as he struggled to comprehend what he had witnessed. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "How did your species understand what would defeat them when all our technology and knowledge failed?" Jake looked out at the stars that were visible again now that the enemy fleet had vanished. "Because we tell stories," he said simply. We tell stories about heroes who stand against the darkness not because they think they can win, but because someone has to try. We tell stories about warriors who choose honor over survival and sacrifice over safety. Dr. Lisa Kane established the Institute for Mythic Studies in the rebuilt council chambers, where representatives from hundreds of species came to understand how legends shaped practical reality. The new curriculum included courses on heroic narratives and the power of inspirational mythology, alongside traditional subjects like mathematics and quantum physics. The Devourers were perfect expressions of logical efficiency, she taught her alien students. They could calculate optimal solutions to any problem except one: beings who acted against their own rational self-interest for the sake of others. They could not understand heroes, and that inability destroyed them. The new Galactic Council looked very different from the one that had mocked human legends 2 years earlier. Humanity now occupied the primary seats not through conquest, but through recognition that some forms of wisdom could not be measured by technological advancement or mathematical precision. Species that had fled during the crisis returned to find their homeworlds protected by volunteer fleets that flew under banners showing ancient human symbols, mixed with alien designs that honored the same eternal values. Knights and samurai and Celtic warriors had become universal archetypes representing the choice to stand for others, regardless of personal cost.